Today we're starting a new chapter, which is Matthew chapter 14, looking at this famous story of the events around the beheading of John the Baptist. We'll be 2 days looking at Matthew chapter 14, 1 to 12. Today we're going to do pretty much an exposition through the actual text, and then tomorrow I'll come back and tell you what I think the main message and what it's trying to tell us. So with that said, let's drop in and pick up where we left off last time. Now, before I actually read the scriptures to you, I have to say that over the years I've talked to a lot of people about the Lord, and some people have just flat out told me that they do not believe that Jesus Christ, certainly he's not the Son of God, and they don't accept him, that he's even the Messiah of the Old Testament. On some of those occasions I've said to them, well then what is your explanation to who Jesus was? Who he was if he's not who he said he was? If Jesus Christ is not the Son of God, if Jesus Christ is not the Messiah promised in the Old Testament, then what is your opinion as to who he was and is? Some will reply and say, well, they accept he was a good moral man, or he was a great teacher, or some just say he's a historical figure who was the founder of this religion called Christianity. People who say he do not even believe he exists at all, I kind of tend to give no time to at all. But these other people who give these other answers, what intrigues me is how do they arrive at those conclusions? On some occasions I do actually press on and ask the person, how did you arrive at the conclusion of what you say? Why do you believe he was a moral man? Why do you believe he was a great teacher? So what I'd like us to do today is ask those questions again of ourselves and hopefully come up with some reasonable explanations that might help us to have a strategy to deal with similar reactions to our faith and our Saviour in our conversations with everyday people. I would like us to look at some of the common explanations of why people think Jesus is who they think he is. But I would also like to dig a little deeper and find out why some of the people have reached those conclusions. So this is going to be broader than just asking questions about who Jesus is, because there is a sense in this passage that we're going to look at that it itself way beyond that, because it looks not only at the decision people make, and that's mainly Herod Antipas on this occasion, but also it asks us to think about why he made that decision. What was his motivation? So after reading the text, we'll come back and examine that in more detail. Now, this passage has a story, and it's important because it has a story of someone who very specifically comes to a conclusion about who Jesus was. And Matthew, I believe, included it in his gospel account to tell us not only why this fellow said what he said, why Herod reacted the way he did, but also what made him say it. And that process may give us insight into, well, at least one of the reasons that people make decisions that we make. And also we may give us some insight into why we make the decisions we make. So with that in mind, turn with me to Matthew chapter 14, and I'm going to begin to read to you from verse 1. And read the whole passage, and then we'll work through for today, verse by verse, and pretty much cover the whole text this morning. Okay, it begins by saying, at that time Herod, the Tetrarch, heard the report about Jesus, and said to his servants, this is John the Baptist, he is risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are at work in him. For Herod had laid hold of John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because John had said to him, it is not lawful for you to have her. And although he wanted to put him to death, he feared the multitude, because they counted him as a prophet. But when Herod's birthday was celebrated, the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod. Therefore he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. So she, having been prompted by her mother, said, give me the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And the king was sorry. Nevertheless, because of the oaths, and because of those who sat with him, when he said them, he commanded it to be given to her. So he sent and had John beheaded in prison, and his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. Then his disciples came and took away the body and buried it, and went and told Jesus. So here we go. This is the story of, well, what happens to John the Baptist, but it's ultimately the events and the story around Herod the Tetrarch. And in many ways, it reads like a modern soap opera, doesn't it? As a matter of fact, I would suggest that if you understand this story, it's very similar to the sort of melodramas, over-the-top dramas of many modern-day thrillers and soap operas. Now, there are several of these melodramatic type stories in the Old Testament, but this is a rare example of such a thing in the New Testament, and it is probably the most dramatic story of its type in the New Testament. It's all about Herod and what he believed, yet clustered around him there are several figures that play their part in the plot of this story. So what I want us to do primarily is look at Herod and his motivations, but in the process also look at some of the other minor players in these events. And it all begins with Herod. It tells us in verse 1 that he is Herod the Tetrarch. In other words, he was a political leader of a region at that time in Israel. Now I need to pause right away and explain here who this person Herod is, because when we hear it, we automatically, I would think, most of us tend to think of Herod Agrippa, who was the political leader at the time Christ was born. You remember, he was the person who ordered that all the children aged 2 or under should be slaughtered. I'm sure you remember that story and its connection with the arrival of the wise men. However, this is not the same man. As a matter of fact, that Herod died in 4 BC, and this Herod was his second son. He's better known separately as Herod Antipas. So this is not Herod the Great, it's someone who followed on called Herod Antipas. It's sort of a bit like George Bush, remember, in the 90s being president, and then some 10 or so years later, I can't remember, 10 or 12 years later, his son came along and became president. Only there is a difference here in that these Herods, in this story, they don't actually hold the same office as their fathers. They had positions of influence, yes, and authority, yes, but in different parts of the country. But the important point is this is not Herod the Great of the Nativity story. It is Herod Antipas, who is identified here as Herod the Tetrarch. In other words, he is named after the position he held. And the first thing it tells us is that he hears a report about Jesus. Now, for him to hear about what was going on in the Palestine area would not be unusual, as he was one of the political leaders in the region. But some suggest that he had not heard about Jesus up till this point, for the simple reason that Jesus had not been out of the country or the region of Galilee at that point in his own life. But anyway, Herod the Antipas hears about the miracles of Jesus that are going on, and this may very well be a reference to these miracles that we've just been looking at, one after another, in chapters 8, 9 and 10 of Matthew's Gospel, the stuff that's happening around Capernaum and even Nazareth, his hometown, which we looked at in the latter part of chapter 13 a few days ago. At any rate, the plot is this. Herod hears about Jesus, and when we look at verse 2, and he says to his servant, "This is John the Baptist, he is risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are at work in him." So he hears about Jesus and he comes to this, well, it seems almost incredulous conclusion that whoever this fellow named Jesus is, he is actually really John the Baptist come back to life. You see, although Matthew hasn't mentioned it up to this point, John the Baptist is dead already as this narrative's been written. So Herod, at this point, knowing John is dead and hears about these miracles, conclude that Jesus is in fact John the Baptist coming back from the dead. Perhaps he's in fear fueled by a guilty conscience. Now in the world we hear all sorts of explanations from people even today about who they think Jesus was, but this reaction of Herod Antipas to who he decides Jesus is really one for the books, isn't it? In Matthew chapter 14, it opens by telling us that Herod is perplexed, confused about Jesus. He's actually thinking he's John the Baptist, so he's totally flummoxed by this. And the story opens up with Herod being confused, but look at what happens next. So this is talking about his motivation and why he might think he was John the Baptist, because it then says, "For Herod had laid hold of John and bound him and put him in a prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because John had said to him, 'It is not lawful for you to have her.'" Here we're getting into the meat of this situation. In the New Testament, where a sentence begins with the word therefore, it tells that the author is going to give us an explanation or a reason for what he has just said before. So the first couple of verses, they were telling us that Herod is all messed up and he thinks that Jesus is the resurrected John the Baptist. But now Matthew is going to explain to us how and why Herod reached that conclusion. Now, virtually all Bible teachers that approach this passage say that beginning here at verse 3, there is a story being told in flashback. That's certainly what's happening here, as the details of what comes next prove conclusively that John the Baptist was in fact already dead when the events unfold at the start of this chapter. That's obvious from the fact that Herod was saying he was raised from the dead. So that means clearly at that point he was already dead. And now what follows is an explanation of how he died. So this is the author, Matthew's, literally technique, so to speak, of starting with the conclusion of where we are now and then giving us a flashback to explain how we got here and how Herod reached the conclusion that he reached. To put it same thing another way, in this passage, verse 1 or 2, are what Herod thought and concluded about Jesus, and in the rest of the passage, from verses 3 to 12, we are given at the events that led him to arrive at such a conclusion. And the text then begins to do that by telling us that Herod laid hold of John and bound him and put in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. Now again, we need to pause for a second, and I think I need to explain what that means and what's going on here. By the way, we not only know these events are true from this Bible text here and the other Gospel accounts, but there was also a first century historian named Josephus, and he records these events in detail as well. So we have confirmation of what I'm going to say outside of the Bible text here. But what has happened, what has gone on here is Herod Antipas, he has a half-brother and he's named Philip. Now, this guy was not a high-ranking political leader, but he was a wealthy individual, a wealthy man who lived in Rome. And Herod, we are told, took a trip to Rome to visit him and his wife was called Herodias. But Herod took a shine, his half-brother Philip's wife, Herodias, and he seduced her, and he actually convinced her to marry him. So he came back and divorced his current wife and married his sister-in-law, in effect, Herodias. And that's what verse 3 is telling us about and dealing with. Because as a result of this, we hear that John the Baptist gets arrested because he had gone to him and said, what you're doing is not lawful. It is not lawful under the law of Moses to take your brother's wife as your wife. Under the law of God, as revealed to Moses, under the Old Testament teaching, John the Baptist knew that Herod had absolutely broken the moral law by divorcing his current wife for no good reason and marrying this other woman. This, of course, had involved Herod first seducing his brother's wife, and therefore very likely having an affair outside of marriage, and John the Baptist spoke up and probably preached against it publicly, and that is what got him arrested and thrown into prison. That's what's going on here, and the next verse tells us what Herod wants to do about this situation. So Herod, his motivation in his heart, it says this, he wanted to put him to death, but he feared the multitude because they counted him as a prophet. So what Herod clearly wanted to do was to eliminate John the Baptist totally. But this verse tells us that he was afraid of what the ordinary people in the street might say because they considered and recognized John the Baptist as a prophet. So Herod is just confounded on all sides. I mean, this guy's got some real problems here. He's got this messed up marriage situation. He's got this popular, famous, one might say, prophet out there preaching against what he's doing, saying that he shouldn't have divorced his wife, he shouldn't have had this affair. And in a human level, one would say naturally, Herod, he's saying, well, I want the end of this guy, I want to kill him. But he doesn't even feel he's free to do that because this guy, John the Baptist, is so popular. So in this state of emotional turmoil, he reached the point where he actually even thinks at a time that maybe when this Jesus appears, that he's been haunted by this John the Baptist who he brought an end to, that John the Baptist has now come back from the dead. And now the text is going to tell us and show us how, in fact, John the Baptist ended up being killed by Herod. So now we're going to have the flashback as to how John the Baptist got killed and how he, Herod Antipas, might have got himself to such a point where he had reached the conclusion that John the Baptist had been resurrected from the dead. And in doing that, I want to look at this passage and look at the motivation of the people in it and the decisions that they make, and Herod particularly, but not just him, some of the other minor players. The text tells us that Herod's motivation was in part at this point stalled by the fact that he feared the crowd, he feared the public reaction. So clearly the decision he made at that point was not initially to kill John the Baptist, even though he wanted it, and the reason was he was afraid that it might have led to a popular uprising. So let me draw the picture of Herod before we go on with the story. Herod Antipas, from everything we know about him, was probably a very powerful, striking man who was used to getting his own way. He was obviously ambitious. He was obviously sensual. Today, we would call him a womanizer or a ladies' man, but he also underneath had a violent, superstitious, some might say paranoid and wicked personality. A wicked individual, but underpinning all of that was the fact that he was a man driven by fear. Fear of what he should do and fear of what the people might think. He feared what the people, how they might react, but what is not immediately obvious, but will become obvious as we penetrate the story further, is that he was a man who underneath probably felt guilty of what John had said he had done, and what he had done therefore to John the Baptist. So that's the story up to this point, if you like, the end of scene 1. It then flashes back to this birthday celebration. So let me just read for you Matthew 14:6 and 7. But when Herod's birthday was celebrated, the daughter of Herodias, remember that's his new wife, danced before them and pleased Herod. Therefore he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. So the next thing we see in this next scene is Herod having a birthday party, a great celebration, and it is here we see the daughter of Herodias introduced, not named in this one. But what it does tell us is that she danced before him, and in a sense she seduced Herod through her dance to the point that he promised to give her whatever she asked for. But it's worth noting that she'd been prompted by her mother, who had said that what she should say she wants is the head of John the Baptist on the plate. Now remember, this is Herod's birthday party, and he's gathered all his closest friends together, and he's the ruler, and he's got power, and he wants his birthday party to display that power, and he's taking the opportunity to show off his new wife. And apparently this girl dancing before the people is actually the daughter of his new wife. Now that should ring an alarm bell, shouldn't it? The daughter of all things is brought in and dances before not just Herod, but all these men, and the text says she dances before them, and it pleased them. So it's clearly implying there's something seductive going on here. Now there are estimates that vary to how old this girl was, but almost everybody concludes that she was probably a teenager. The oldest estimate I've seen is that she was 17, and I have seen some people who suggest she might be as young as 12, which raises a red flag, doesn't it? I suspect that actually, looking at the text and the people who are expert understanding the use of Greek words, they tell me that it's most likely she was a teenager between 15 and 17. But what's very clear, she was probably quite attractive. And it is this young girl who walks in at the acquiescence of her mother and dances what is clearly a sensuous dance in front of everyone. So clearly there's an element of shamelessness in her, or that's being promoted by her, because in the end of the day, she was a royal princess and she was acting as a dancing girl. And Bible experts agree that that wasn't the norm, and that they also say that the dance, by use of the language used in this text, say that it was suggestive, something that would have been very out of character, usually for a royal princess. Anyway, Herod and the others watch this dance, and he's taken up with her, so much so that he says to her, "You name it and I'll give it to you." And then in verse 7 it told us, in fact, he swears an oath. So in a sense, he writes this girl and her mother a blank check, and he does it in front of all these people who witness it. Now, the girl initially at this point wasn't sure what to do, but the mother, you see, is heavily involved in the background. So it is the mother who comes up to the suggestion. Now, remember the fact that her mother and Herod had a problem. And the problem was with this guy, John the Baptist. He had publicly denounced their marriage. So I think it's safe to assume that she didn't like this guy. It might be safe to say that she was angry at him, and you could reasonably push it further and say she hated him, and that what she wanted was vengeance for the situation as it has arisen. She was very vindictive. So here's what she says. "I'll tell you what to ask for," she says. So, and then the text tells us, so having been prompted by her mother, the girl says, "Give me the Baptist's head on a platter." So Herodias is using her daughter to gain revenge on the man who has justly rebuked her. So clearly she's a woman who does not hesitate to use her own daughter to realize her vindictive ends, and in the most inappropriate of ways. It would be bad enough if she herself had taken vengeance on this man of God, John the Baptist, the one who had condemned her, but it was infinitely worse that she was using her daughter for her purposes, and she was doing it in a way that made her daughter, well, you have to say it, a great sinner. What can we say about a parent who uses their child, their own child, in order to achieve some evil purposes? Sadly, we see that happening today in the world, don't we? We see people in some countries enabling their children, selling their children into situations of sexual slavery or internet porn. And this is like the equivalent of that in those days. It's a sordid, a pathetic story, and in many ways reminds me of a modern-day potboiler thriller. So, what happens next? Well, because of the oaths that he's sworn in front of the people, and because he's done it in front of them, he commands that it be carried out. And so he sends out and orders, and John the Baptist is indeed beheaded, and his head is brought on a platter and given to the girl, and then she gives it to her mother. So clearly Herod fulfilled his promise. He had made a decision, but he was sorry for that decision. It actually tells us that. And I don't doubt that there was genuine sorrow, but now again he's perplexed. He's torn between the two decisions. But the text says, and I want you to look at this and consider it carefully because I think it's quite insightful in verse 9. I'm going to read verse 9, 10 and 11 for you, and it says, "The king was sorry, but nevertheless, because of the oaths and because of those who sat with him, he commanded it to be given to her." So like I said, he sent and had John the Baptist beheaded in prison, and his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl who brought it to her mother. That's the actual text itself. So Herod is more pressured by the people sitting around him than he is by his own conscience on the inside. The fact that he was sorry tells us there was a conflict here. Remember back in verse 5 it says that he was fearful to make the decision initially. So what we can see here throughout this passage is a man who is constantly driven by fear, makes his decisions out of fear. He is a man who is beholden to the crowd and not to his conscience. So in this situation, he ends it all by saying he issues the order, and John the Baptist is indeed beheaded, and without trial, which in itself was totally illegal. He had just had him thrown in prison, and now, driven by hate and the vindictiveness of his wife and the weakness of him to not be influenced by people around him, he has John the Baptist killed. Someone I read said, "Here is a decision of a weak man. He broke a great law, and he promised his daughter-in-law to give her anything she asked, little thinking she would request what she did." To not grant that request would mean he would have not been keeping the oath that he had made in front of everybody, and he was meant to be the lawmaker. It seems to me that Herod was more frightened of a woman's tantrum than of the moral law of God. He was more frightened of the criticism of others, more controlled by the amusement of his guests than the voice of his own conscience. Herod was a man who could stand firm on wrong things even when he knew what was right. And such a stand is not a sign of strength, but of weakness. He was more faithful to following the crowd and the fads of the people than he was to following his own conscience and the moral law of God, which he knew well. A breach of etiquette was more important to him than breaking the 10 Commandments. And that's how John the Baptist met his end. And that basically is the end of the story. But then Matthew will add a footnote. Matthew adds a footnote in the final verse, and we shall consider what he says tomorrow, and also consider what this story actually was meant to teach the disciples who heard it 2,000 years ago, and what it is meant to teach us today. So do come back again tomorrow when we'll close off this important passage. Okay, we're here today picking up, recovering in a sense the same ground we covered last time. We're looking at the first 12 verses of Matthew chapter 14 and the story of the beheading of John the Baptist. So yesterday we did an exposition just through it, verse by verse, but today we're going to look at what it actually teaches us and what it might mean for us today. So before I try and draw some conclusions and some teachable moments from this passage, let's just look at Matthew's footnote at the end of verse 12, which is where we finished off last time, where it says, "Then his disciples came and took away the body and buried it and went and told Jesus." So this reference to disciples is not a reference to the disciples of Jesus, but rather to the disciples of John the Baptist. They're the ones who claim the body, and they're the ones who bury it. And then it makes this interesting statement that they go and they meet with Jesus and they tell him what has happened. Now, as I said at the beginning of this passage, it's obviously mainly the story of Herod and the people around him. But the last person in the story, the last characters in the story, I should say, is these disciples of John the Baptist. And that's why I wanted to refer to this footnote of the story before going back and looking what the overall story might mean. You see, it's possible that Matthew added it to tell us how Jesus found out about the death and execution and the martyrdom of indeed his childhood friend, John the Baptist. Try and put yourselves in the place of the disciples of John the Baptist for a minute. At this point, you'll know that they followed him, no doubt been following him for several years, and they would have looked up to them as their leader, their rabbi, in fact. They admired him, and he was their mentor. And it says they were his disciples, which means they were, in a way, like his apprentices, his students. The whole idea behind the concept of discipleship at that time is that you would have a teacher and that you would have people who would learn, the disciples, the learners of that teacher. So they were learning from this man, John the Baptist. So at some level, they were personally and intellectually devoted to him as a leader and as an individual. So you can imagine when they found out that he was imprisoned, that would have had a great impact on them. And when they found out that he had been beheaded, they would have, I'm sure, been emotionally devastated. It doesn't take much imagination to see that these disciples were greatly upset and grieved in a way that many of us probably have also been grieved at one time or another in our lives. Now, we normally think of grief in terms of just bereavement, when we lose someone near and dear, and that is certainly true, and that's what is going on here. But I think it's just worth adding a little footnote that grief can go way beyond that. Grief can occur whenever there is any loss of life or loss of identity. So not just the grief that people go through when they lose a loved one. There are other types of grief that are experienced, if you like, on a lesser plane. Anytime we lose anything that we are emotionally attached to, or a circumstance or situation or a relationship that we are attached to, at some level we experience grief whenever there is a loss. Now, what the disciples of John the Baptist are going through is this intense level of grief. But I just want to point out to you, and hopefully it's helpful for us, about what they actually did when they found themselves in this grieving situation. Well, it tells us in this last verse, they went and they met with Jesus. So I just want to point out in passing, before we close off and I try and draw this whole story together, I want to point out that there's a helpful lesson here. It's not the main point of the passage, I grant you, but it's certainly a secondary point and a valid point and an intensely practical point, and that's why I'm bothering to just take a minute and say that we should do as they do and go and take our troubles and our griefs and lay them on the Lord. The Bible talks about casting all your cares upon him because he cares for you. We are meant to tell Jesus all of our troubles because he is a kind, compassionate friend. When we have burdens that we cannot bear alone, we should tell Jesus and allow him to help us carry the load. In other words, we must, at times of grief or heartache, turn to the Lord and say, help me. That's what I believe is a subtext of this passage. I actually think that one of the most valuable spiritual lessons that you can learn in life is to take hold of the fact practically and really embrace it and do it, that when you have a problem, you take it to the Lord, whether it is grief, as it is in this situation, or just confusion about what decision to make, or any burdens you're carrying, or even just needs, or even temptations. Anything else, anything that concerns you, I believe that you can take to the Lord. One of my favourite verses in all of the Bible is Hebrews chapter 4 verse 16, which tells us that we can therefore come boldly to the throne of grace that we might obtain mercy and find grace to help in times of need. That's why we should take our problems to Jesus, because that's where the mercy is, and that's where the grace is available to be given to us that can help us in our times of trouble. Now, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not opposed to you talking to a friend. I'm not even opposed to you talking to a counsellor. I think we sometimes really do need to talk to someone to share our problems. We are social beings after all, and God has created us that way. And I think that social interaction is a critical need in our lives, which is why so many people worldwide suffered when we were forced into these COVID-19 lockdowns. But what I would like to suggest is that before you do anything, when you have a problem, the very first thing you should do is talk to the Lord. According to Isaiah, the Holy Spirit is our counselor, and that God himself is called the great physician. So who better to go to for counsel and healing than the Lord himself? He is the great counselor. He is the one that can help us better than any earthly advice. Now, don't misunderstand me. I know this might sound as if I'm opposed to people speaking to counsellors, and I want to say that that's not true. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. But I do think that part of what the body of Christ is meant to be about is us actually practically, personally supporting one another by meeting with each other and sharing our burdens. We are actually encouraged, particularly in the writings of Paul and the pastoral letters, to minister to one another. But that was never meant to mean taking the place of the Lord to begin with. That's my point. Take it to the Lord, but you don't have to do that in isolation. You can still go and talk to other people about it. But always, I believe, our first point of call should be to stop and take it to the Lord. Some of you might have heard of a very famous author named Oswald Chambers, who lived about 100 years ago. His pattern when someone came to him with a pastoral problem was to say, "Have you ever told the Lord about this problem?" And if the person said no, he would usually suggest that they go home and tell it to the Lord and pray about it. And if they still needed to talk to him a few days later, to come back, and he would be delighted to see them. Anyway, that's a side point. Let's get back to the main story, and I'll try and wrap up this passage for us now. The point of this story, in my estimation, is that Herod has come to the conclusion we saw that Jesus Christ was the resurrected John the Baptist. Now, that at first sight, that's confusing, but what I want to say is that story is telling us that before he arrived at that, what would seem to us bizarre conclusion, the narrative itself chose to tell us about the events that occurred before, ones that would naturally suggest he was probably feeling guilty about his part in the execution of John the Baptist. Now, this passage can suggest many different spiritual insights for us. For one thing, I think we could spend a lot of time talking about the bravery of John the Baptist in approaching and speaking truth into this charged political situation. Or we could talk about the loss of hearing from God in the two main characters of it. Or how about the lewdness of the daughter-in-law, or the rebellious evil intent of the second wife Herodias. And that's only the beginning. But one of the unusual things that I think stands out, and I'll probably address some of those when we come back to this passage in other gospel accounts. But today, one of the usual things that I think stands out here is the fact that Herod, although he believed Jesus was nothing other than John the Baptist resurrected from the dead, he did believe that this person called Jesus was actually working miracles. So the idea that Jesus could produce the miraculous is something it would seem that believers and disciples and non-believers all could ascribe to. Here we have someone who doesn't know him or recognize who he is, in fact is mistaken about who he is, yet he still believes that what is going on is that this person is working miracles. Now, I think we can talk about this passage to the sense of what it means within the context of the Gospel of Matthew. And as you'll know, if we were walking through Matthew and you've arrived with this section, gone through a point where Jesus is starting to meet real opposition and the rejection of him. And one of the results of this, which we've been looking at over the past few days, is that Jesus is beginning to withdraw from the public ministry and to begin to intensely prepare his disciples with teaching and preaching and miraculous events and parables, preparing them in a sense for his departure. But the most dramatic example of opposition, I think, raises its head here in this murder of John the Baptist. It seems to me that the great main point of the story is that both Herod and his new wife Herodias, they made wrong decisions about John, reached wrong conclusions about Jesus particularly, and about the Lord and who he was, and they did that for the wrong reasons. So let me close by taking just a minute and analysing what their motivations were. And let's start with Herod's wife. She was motivated out of anger and vindictiveness. She made a destructive decision, not only one that would lead to the destruction of John the Baptist himself, but as we will see, did not work out well for her or her daughter. Had she listened to John the Baptist, he wouldn't have died, and she would no doubt have been a lot better off. But she didn't listen to him. Rather, she responded out of malice, anger, vindictiveness, and she used her daughter, her own daughter, to participate in a really sordid plot against him in order to have him killed. All of that says to me that we should never make decisions that are fueled from anger, revenge, hatred, anything like that. Just don't go there. Proverbs chapter 24, verse 29 in the Old Testament advises us when it says, "Do not say, I will do to him just as he has done to me. I will render to the man according to his works." Proverbs itself is saying right back in the Old Testament, don't go there, don't do this sort of stuff. Well, what should we do then? Well, the answer, I think, is found in the New Testament in Romans chapter 12, which teaches us that vengeance belongs to the Lord. Let me read to you from Romans 12, 17 to 21, where it tells us, teaches us, repay no one evil for evil, have regard for good things in the sight of all men. If it is as possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to warmth, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Therefore, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink, for in doing so you will heap coals of fire on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. So, therefore, if someone has done something to you, don't even think about responding with malice. Don't think about getting vengeance. Don't think about getting even. Back off and give place to God. In fact, take it to the Lord and let him take care of it. In fact, he will ultimately do a lot better job of dealing with this than you would ever be able to do. Herod, in this situation, it's very clear, he acted out of fear, and he did that on several occasions. But what is not so obvious, though I think it is strongly implied, he also acted out of guilt. And when he acted out of fear and guilt, the decisions he made were destructive decisions, not only for John the Baptist by ending his life, but ultimately for Herod himself. So there's a lot we can learn from this. I think this is the point of the passage, the main point. It is to show that because Herod did what he did, and that he did what he did, motivated by fear and guilt, he came initially to the wrong conclusion about exactly who Jesus Christ was. He came up with this bizarre idea that it was actually the resurrected John the Baptist who he had killed. So his response was entirely fueled by the guilt of what he had done and the fear of retribution. And that's the sum of what I believe Matthew is mainly trying to tell us here. Herod, you see, the starting point is he came to the wrong conclusion about who Jesus Christ really was and how he should respond to him. Now, I want you to be clear, I'm not the only one who comes to this conclusion. One commentator I read, and I quote, said this: "When he heard of the miraculous works of Jesus, he was sure that John the Baptist had risen from the dead, and his conscience was troubling him." And another said, "Even now the furies of conscience pursued him relentlessly, and he was sure that Jesus must be John returned from the dead." Both these 20th century commentators are saying the same thing. They're saying that he acted out of a guilty conscience, and it's never a good thing to respond in that way. Think about it. The miracles, the lovely, healing, miraculous miracles of Christ. So what is your explanation of who Jesus is? Is he just a great teacher? Is he the Son of God? Or is he the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies? Now, in conclusion, I want to dig just a little deeper and ask, how can we too arrive at the correct decision? I believe, ultimately, Herod arrived at the point where he did because he wasn't being objective. He wasn't being reasonable. You might say he wasn't even rational. He was acting out of emotion, negative emotions. We too can choose to respond to Jesus Christ by being objective and look at the facts. Don't be irrational and emotional. Don't let his willingness to call sin sin cause you to feel guilty and fearful, because if you respond in that way, then you will make the wrong decisions about him and who he was, and you will probably make destructive decisions in your life, which will mean only end up hurting yourself and even other people. In this case also, Herod's wife is motivated by anger and vindictiveness, and she too made a destructive decision, and she aimed that wrath at John the Baptist, the one that she perceived as a threat to her marriage. So when you come to look at Jesus Christ, as you see him revealed in these scriptures, look and listen to what he says. Hear what God says. Hear that Jesus Christ is declared to be the Messiah, the Son of God, and that this same Jesus Christ died on the cross to free men and women from their sin. And that Jesus rose from the dead, and by believing and trusting in that, you too can have eternal life as a free gift, simply by trusting in him. If we look objectively at the facts, then the conclusion that most of us will come to, if we do it without prejudice or prejudgment, we will come to the right conclusion every time. Me personally, I came to that conclusion some time ago. But I have recognized in my life that when people are angry, fearful, or guilty, they don't think straight and they're not able to make the right decisions. Now, you too maybe, because of the events of your life, have a degree of anger or hurt, or maybe you're even grieving a situation. But I don't know how many times I've said to people, you just need to take time, wait a minute, think about it objectively, take it to the Lord, meditate on it, because you're in no position to make that decision today because you're experiencing those emotions. You can't literally think straight, and you won't make a good decision. I recently talked to someone who had just gone through a bereavement, and they were very, very angry at God at the circumstances which they had had to live through the last couple of years, and with the loss of their life. Yet at the same time, they had just begun dating again within 3 months of the death of his wife. And I said to him, you know what? I'm not saying he couldn't remarry again. He was free to remarry, of course he was. But I said to him, it seemed to me at the moment you're angry and you're grieving. So please don't even think about making a decision for a while. Perhaps a year or a couple of years, maybe before doing anything like dating. And I believe that advice goes for any great emotional experience. Anything that you've gone through that has had a large emotional impact on you. In other words, don't go there. At those points in time, you're in no position to be objective. When angry or fearful or guilt-ridden, you're not able to see the grace that lies in the teaching and the ministry of Jesus. I know that in my life, every time I've made a decision when I'm angry or guilty or fearful, I have not made the right decision. Every time I've made a decision based on those sorts of emotions, I've made a decision that was not profitable to me in the short term and maybe caused great harm for me in the longer term. Bottom line, make the right decisions about Jesus Christ and who he is. And do it by seriously, peacefully meditating on the Word of God, on the Bible and what it says about him. And then you will be able to be in the right place to make the right decision, not only about him, but also about all the other relationships in your life and how you should deal with other people.